Welcome to SPED 780, Module 1. Today we're going to really look at Chapters 1 and 2, Potential Disruption and Status of the Classroom. So I hope before you've looked at this video, you've read those two chapters. They're a pretty easy read, and they're really going to lay the foundation for the learners that we're talking about in the secondary classroom with high incidence disabilities. The point of this presentation is just to build on that information, provide you some more detail, provide you some more resources related to what you're reading about. So let's take a look at that. So we're going to take a look at chapters 1 and 2. Then we're going to look at some of the activities that you're going to do as a kind of cumulative activity for these chapter questions in the discussion forum. So when we look at chapter 1, we really look at putting all these pieces together when we talk about instruction, especially instruction in that secondary classroom. And we're looking at best practices. I think the textbook really lays out a nice foundation for what that looks like, talking about a planning pyramid, how we plan for those students, how we use our instructional time in a unique way to really hit on those standards and cover a lot of content. How we plug in universal design for learning. That's something we're going to take a look at really throughout this semester, especially when we get into content areas specific. How we really structure design of learning to meet students' unique needs. And then those multiple intelligences, that's been around forever, right? Howard Gardner's multiple intelligences. What does that look like in our classrooms today? And how can we really improve our instruction by considering those multiple intelligences? And this all allows us to really design lessons around standards. Our first goal and what we do when we're putting together instruction is we look at that standard. What's the student outcome? And then we really look at how do we apply that. So when we look at levels of learning, okay, you'll notice in the book they talked about 3 levels. The first is bare bones, okay? Out of that standard, what do we want all students to know and be able to do by the end of the lesson? And then the second one is that realistically, what will most students be able to do? And then finally, that little tip of the triangle that you see is what do we want students to be able to do above that basic standard for the content area, okay? When we look at multiple intelligences, we know that schools commonly focus on linguistic, logical, math intelligence in terms of how they produce instruction and how students interact with instruction. But when we look at Howard Gardner's research, we know there are lots of other ways that students can learn successfully, and lots of ways students are just programmed differently to learn, whether that be through music, through a naturalistic way of learning, or through maybe bodily kinesthetic, okay, learning through movement. We have to really make sure that we consider those pieces. That universal design comes in as it allows us to layer instruction to meet students' needs. So you will hear me frequently mention things like multiple means of expression. So how are students showing us that they've mastered content? What are lots of different ways that they can do that? How can we accommodate students in how they're demonstrating mastery? Multiple means of representation. So how are we providing students with access to information and content in lots of different ways? And that's a really common concept of universal design for learning. And then multiple means of assessment. So how are we assessing students? And how frequently are we assessing students? Beyond just your typical paper, pencil, pre- and post-test assessment. What are some tools that we can do? Now we're going to really get into the nitty-gritty of all 3 of those when we get into content-specific areas in this textbook. For example, when we start looking at specifically reading in the secondary classroom or writing in the secondary classroom, and how we can make accommodations and modifications for our students with high incidence learning needs. And then when we look at instructional time, we know that those secondary classrooms are packed with standards that we need to cover, right? So how do we really manage our instructional time to meet those standards and also meeting students' different learning needs? If you take a look at page 11 in your textbook, figure 1.5, it's a great tool that you can use with your students to really survey how they want to learn, and it gives us information for these pieces that we're talking about here, allowing students to provide you feedback on how best they learn, what kind of tools work for them, and what things don't work for them, and allows us to really individualize their instruction. So as we talk about multiple means of expression, here's an example. One of the things I want to do in this course is each week talk about assistive technology at work. So there is an assistive technology course that we used to offer within this program. Now we're plugging that into each class, which makes sense because we know that technology plays such a big role in our students' lives and plays a big role in our instruction. And so in this course, each week, each module is going to have an AT at work concept that we'll look at. It'll either be a resource or an app or a different way of looking at how we apply assistive technology in the classroom and how we plug that into the IEP then. So today we're going to look at one called the Week in Wrap. This is a great example when we look at that universal design for learning, providing students with content in various means, various ways of accessing the content. So for example, this one, instead of maybe reading the news headlines in a newspaper, the students listen to the Week in Wrap. Okay, it's video-based wrap news. The thing I love about this resource is it really provides great research-based sequencing in how students learn. So students watch a video, they do a quick review after the video, where they're just getting some feedback on those key points they needed to remember from the video. There's great vocabulary cards that allow students to really build their vocabulary based on that news for the week. And then there's a quiz that assesses what students learned, assesses their mastery of that information. And then at the end, takes it a step further, allows students to create a wrap of their own on the big facts that they pulled out of that week in review. That Week in Wrap. So you can take a look at this resource. We're going to go there quickly and just watch a brief example of it. I'll let it load here for us. Okay, let's see what we've got.
Shout out to Shelton Intermediate School in Shelton, Connecticut. Happy New Year. Welcome to 2018, a brand new year. Let's do great things and have no fear. If you set resolutions and follow through with vocabulary here, and we brought the news with us. Iraq has declared that after 3 years, the fight against ISIS is over. Oh yeah? Wow. But after all of that combat, they have to rebuild the cities that the battles were fought at. But get this, there are still surviving guerrilla warfare. Very many recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. Brought in my slang, but things just got real. It caused a bit.
Okay, so that kind of gives you an example of what those look like, and then you'll see the teacher resources to the left. You've got the vocab, the read and response, a quiz, and then the area where the students can create their own wrap. This is just a good example of a tool that we can use, how we can use technology in the classroom, how we can use those universal design for learning principles. For example, this one hits that multiple means of representation to meet students' unique needs in how they learn. And this also would allow us to plug into an IEP, for example, that students need access to. Maybe a student's a visual learner, musical learner. This would be appropriate. We could write that AT into the IEP, saying that content needed to provide when available, that the student content would be in musical or picture format to meet their learning needs. That's a great way of using assistive technology in the IEP itself. So one of the things I like that this book does is it really breaks down what these learners are like today, okay, that we have in secondary schools. So we call this group the Generation M2, so this is Generation Mobile. It's interesting to think about. These students have been alive only in the digital age. That's all they know. And so they expect technology to really be a part of their daily life. Let's take a look quickly at what that means.
My name is Alejandra, and I'm 13, and like on a daily basis, I go on my phone in the morning, and I'll check my Instagram, Snapchat, Kick, Twitter, Tumblr, Vine, go to school, then I come back, and I'll use like, I'll go on Netflix, and I'll go to my room, and I'll listen to like Pandora, Spotify, I'll play my Xbox, like Grand Theft Auto, and Call of Duty, and that's about it. If I would add up all, like, the time that I use, I think I would spend about 7 to 8 hours every day. When I'm on social media, I feel like I know what's going on. You do feel a little connected, and like what people are up to. Like, I'll post pictures or videos. I'll like comment on stuff. I don't think I'm addicted to it, my phone. I think it's like, it's kind of a leash though. Because you always have to be on it. And, when I hear buzz, I'm like, oh, I have friends.
I'm Sasha. I'm 16 years old. Currently, I have the Xbox 360 MacBook Pro laptop, the iPad, the old Xbox, a Samsung Galaxy smartphone, and the PlayStation 4. I like to play a lot of different video games on the console on my PS4 when I get home, and I just, veg out sometimes and play. I have, first-person shooter like Call of Duty or Battlefield, and we also have a baseball game that I've been playing. I absolutely think that there is an addictive quality to video games. Sometimes I'll just keep going if I really want to level up in a video game.
Usually when I do my homework, when I get home, I'll either come in my room, listen to music, or I'll go to the living room and watch TV while I do my homework. If I'm like reading something and I get distracted from the TV, or like I'll pause it, or I'll turn off the music, and like I'll go through the problem again, or whatever I'm working on. I guess I was just a little distracted.
If I'm doing my homework on my laptop, I might be also having conversations with my friends, or intermittently checking my phone. Sometimes if I just get too bored of my homework, I might play like Candy Crush or something. When I was younger, I could go much longer without using media, but when I'm in an environment that has a lot of media and all of my friends are on media, then I find it hard to kind of resist.
Something that Toby will never understand.
So that gives us a great kind of insight into what students are doing outside of their school day with technology. Think about that, 9 hours on technology that the average teen is using. And so that's an incredible amount of time that then if you come to school and all your work is done paper pencil, you can see how that's not necessarily meeting the learner needs of today. So I wanted to take a look at just some data that's out there. The Common Sense Media does surveys every year on technology use in teens and tweens. And this is just a great way to stay kind of up to date on the general picture of what kids are doing outside of their school day. So I want to look at some statistics here. Among teens who text, look at the number of texts sent in a day. By boys, the largest portion are sending 11 to 30 texts. The average is 39. When we look at girls, 69 texts are sent in a day. The biggest portion there, again, is that 11 to 30 texts a day. But the average is 69. Isn't that incredible? On any given day, teens and tweens who use a platform or do activities as part of their homework, this is interesting. Using a computer, primarily teens are doing that compared to the tweens, 38%. Using a smartphone, 22% are using that to do work. 17% using text messages. Okay, using a tablet, 7%. So you can see that as kids get older, they're more likely to use technology than those tweens, that middle school age range of kids. The other thing I think that's important to consider is just the socioeconomic status and the gap that we see in terms of access to technology still today. If you'll notice the green and lime green table there, it talks about ownership of devices by income. So lower income is that light green. It's less than 35% a year. Notice 54% of those teens have a laptop in the home, compared to the higher income of $100,000 a year or more has 92%. Okay. Also looking at having their own laptop, really big gap there, 25% to 62%. Having their own smartphone on teens, 51% to 78%. So those of you who may teach in a lower socioeconomic district, you're going to see a bigger gap there in terms of what kinds of technology kids have access to at home. The other chart that we see there just talks again about proportion of a day that students spend with screen media. So you can see that teens greater than 8 hours is at 26%. Okay, 4 to 8 hours is at 31%. So over the majority of students are spending at least 4 hours, if not more, on screen media a day. When we look at tweens, their stats are just a little bit different. You've got 11% that are at that big, over 8 hours. And then 27% are spending between 4 to 8 hours a day with screen media. So you can see that that really jumps up when we get into those teen years. Those high school students are spending a tremendous amount of time with a screen in front of them during their day. So I think this is just helpful in terms of as we look at instruction, as we look at developing curriculum for those students in high school classrooms, even our students with special needs, this is where they're coming from. Okay, this is where their mind is at. It's into this technology, and it's into the tools that they're using outside of their school day. One of the other things that was really interesting is that the text talked about preparing students for college and the workforce. This is an area of growth that has been exceptional in the last few years, especially for our students with disabilities. 32% of working age people with disabilities are employed. Okay, so 32% are employed. That leaves a really big group of our population as they graduate from high school that do not have employment, and that's a pretty big issue for us as a society as a whole. So when we look at preparing these students, we talk about transition plans. We also need to be considering the college workforce in that. Okay, and there's some things that have really affected this. The Higher Education Opportunity Act of 2008 really allowed for students with disabilities to be eligible for financial aid, and that kind of opened the door for those students to have access to college because it wasn't necessarily based on grades. So one of the things we want to look at is post-secondary programs for students with intellectual disabilities. There's a big growth in this in colleges. My husband and I coordinate a special needs ministry for our church, and we go to this special needs fair that our community has every year for parents, and it has a range of organizations that are there. It might be places that offer summer camps, it's churches that offer services, it's therapy-based programs that students can have access to in the summer. But the other thing that we've noticed over the course of the last 3 or 4 years is we've seen a number of D1, Division II, and junior colleges there at this fair providing information on the programs they have for students with intellectual disabilities. There's a lot of growth in this area. For example, in Kansas, the Johnson County Community College has a program called the CLEAR program. It offers students with intellectual disabilities to come into JCC and work towards a 2-year degree with assistance. KU has a program called TPE, the Transition to Post-Secondary Education, where they have a dorm environment. Those students come in, they take courses that prepare them for college, take courses related to the workforce, related to home life and being self-sufficient, those kinds of things, really preparing them for the world outside of K-12 school. And then Mid-American Nazarene in Olathe, Kansas has the Community Transition Program, which functions very similar to that. So what these programs typically do is they allow students with intellectual disabilities to come into the college environment, take college courses. Sometimes they take courses that are designed specifically for them. More often than not, they have dorm experiences, so the students move there and live there. And what these programs are finding, just in the initial research that's being done, is these students have a much higher rate of employment than the students who leave high school without this kind of support as a post-secondary education opportunity. So it's a really interesting development. It's something we're going to look at more closely as we get into the transition module and look at transition services for students. But I just wanted to put this out there for you. If you're interested in learning more, if you go to thinkcollege.net, it has all kinds of resources, information by state on what this looks like. So really the foundation for this course is looking at inclusion, right? We've got these students who are in secondary programs that have high incidence disabilities, and we're looking at how do we give them access to the general ed curriculum, which really by definition is how do we implement inclusion in those settings. I love this definition from the book on what inclusion is. So when you look at it, inclusion is not something you do for students. Rather, it's an underlying belief of academic access and social success for all students being a part of the general ed setting. So we know that having access to that curriculum is vital for these students to be successful out of high school, right? It's also vital for them to be successful socially out of high school. When I was growing up, my brother Phil was identified as having a disability when he entered kindergarten. And he would fall under that mental retardation category. Now has some autism characteristics as well. But he was part of the first graduating class that used inclusion in our community. And so he was included in the general education curriculum for 70% of his day from first grade to high school, to when he graduated. And that made a big difference in his preparation for life out of high school. Partly because he was in classrooms with typical developing peers. He saw typical developing peers in their behaviors, in how they socially interacted with other students, in how they learned, and how they paid attention in the class. All of those things were really critical for him. And it really made a difference in then his employment prospects when he got out. He became a pretty social kid. And he has worked at Walmart for 16 years now, just celebrated 16, because he has great social skills. So he doesn't necessarily have some of, for example, the math skills that he needs to have that job, but he's very social. He is a value to that organization because he has developed some of those skills, and he's a hard worker. And so that made a real big impact on his ability to stay employed, having access to the general ed curriculum and being a part of inclusion. One of the things I think this book lays out that's interesting is inclusion is and inclusion is not. And it really causes us to kind of question our beliefs about inclusion, to look at our classrooms and our schools, our high schools, and look at how does our school really define inclusion. And I think as you read this, what I'd really like you to do is think about, okay, my current setting, my current classroom, my current school, do we define inclusion that way, or is that really that's not how we look at inclusion yet? And one of the things that I think most schools are not quite at yet, something that we need to work towards, is the last line that you see there, students getting counseling. This is talking about college counselors. So are students with special needs seen by college counselors just like all the other students, or are they only counseled about transition by their special ed teachers? Okay, that's one of the goals I have in this class, is how do we get there? How do we make sure that our students are being seen by those college counselors and that our high school counselors see that as a benefit? Another one that's interesting for high schools is students have electives. So are our students able to choose from a wide range of electives, or are their choices kind of limited based on their disability? And then students taking classes at the same content level as their non-disabled peer. So are we giving them access to the classes based on their learning needs, based on their desires, or do we kind of have all those students kind of on a certain track of classes that are really just for students with special needs? So when you read this and you think about this, I want you to really think about, okay, what is it like in my school? How are we looking at inclusion? How are we defining it for these students? Now for this course, when we talk about high incidence disabilities, this is what we're talking about. We're talking about learning disabilities, we're talking about speech and language disorders, cognitive disabilities or intellectual disabilities, as I mentioned with the college or post-secondary programs, emotional behavioral disabilities, and other health impairments. So kind of keep that in your mind, is that when we say high incidence disabilities in this class, these are the disabilities that we are talking about. Now, I hope this provides some additional information on what you've read, some additional resources to kind of get deeper into that content. What I would like you to do now is complete those chapter questions. Make sure you're including information from this instructional video, from the chapter, as you answer those questions. And don't forget to consider how you're citing your sources. Okay? If you want me to take a look at your chapter questions before you submit them and just say, hey, am I on the right track? This is the first time I'm submitting them to you. Want to make sure I'm doing it right. Shoot me an email. I'll take a look at it and give you some feedback. And then participate in that discussion forum for Module 1 activities.